A very large party in the United States believe that holding slaves is morally wrong. This party founds its belief upon precepts taught in the Bible, and takes that book as the standard of morality and religion. We also look to the same book as our guide in the same matters, yet we think it right to hold slaves, do hold them, and have held and used them from childhood. As we come to such opposite conclusions from the same foundation, it may be well to consider whether the Bible teaches us anything whatever in regard to slavery. If so, what is it, and how is it taught? The anti-slavery party maintain that the Bible teaches nothing directly upon the subject, but that it establishes rules and principles of action from which they infer that in holding slaves we are guilty of a moral wrong. This mode of reasoning would be perfectly fair if the Bible really taught nothing directly upon the subject of slavery. But when that book applies the principles it lays down to the particular subject in controversy, we must take the application to be correct. We think we can show that the Bible teaches clearly and conclusively that the holding of slaves is right, and if so, no deduction from general principles can make it wrong, if that book is true. From the earliest period of our time down to the present moment, slavery has existed in some form or under some name in almost every country in the globe. It existed in every country known, even by name, to any one of the sacred writers at the time of his writing, yet none of them condemns it to the slightest degree. Would this have been the case if it had been wrong in itself? Would not someone of the host of sacred writers have spoken of this alleged crime in such terms as to show, in a manner not to be understood, that God wished all men to be equal? Abraham, the chosen servant of God, had his bondservants, whose condition was similar to, or worse than, that of our slaves. He considered them as his property, to be bought and sold as any other property which he owned. In Genesis 17, verses 13, 23, and 27, we are told that God commanded Abraham to circumcise all his bondservants, quote, bought with his money, unquote, and that Abraham obeyed God's commandment on this same day. In Genesis 10, verse 14, we are told that Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants and gave them to Abraham. In chapter 12, verse 14, we are told that Abraham possessed sheep and oxen and his asses and men servants and maidservants and she-asses and camels. Also, in Genesis 26, verse 14, Isaac is said to have had possession of flocks and herds and a great store of servants. In other places in Genesis they are spoken of, but always as property. Paul wrote an epistle to Philemon, a Christian, a disciple of his, and a slaveholder. He sent it to him by Onesimus, also a convert, a slave of Philemon, who was a fugitive. In it, he prays to Philemon to charge the fault of Onesimus to him, saying he would repay it, unless Philemon forgave it for his sake. Now, had the holding of slaves been a crime, Paul's duty to Philemon would have required him to instruct Philemon that he had no rights over Onesimus, his slave, but that the attempt to hold him in servitude was criminal, and his duty to Onesimus would have been, in such case, to send him to some foreign free country whereby he might have escaped from oppression. But Paul sent him back. We find, then, that both the Old and New Testaments speak of slavery, that they do not condemn the relation, but on the contrary, expressly allow it or create it, and they give commands and exhortations which are based upon its legality and propriety. It cannot, then, be wrong. What we have written is founded solely upon the Bible, and can have no force unless it is taken for truth. If that book is of divine origin, the holding of slaves is right, as that which God has permitted, recognized and commanded, cannot be inconsistent with his will. As the abolitionist movement grew more prominent both worldwide and in the United States, White Southerners developed an elaborate system of arguments and justifications for the continuing practice of slavery. One of the most important arguments in favor of slavery was the biblical argument. White Southerners argued that the Holy Bible, the guide to morality by the author of the universe, endorsed slavery rather than condemning it. It was of course very important for them to show that the Bible condoned slavery because the United States was mostly populated by Christians, and appealing to the faith of the majority has always been a useful tool for swaying public opinion throughout history. But it was also important for them to do this because many abolitionists also used the Bible and Christian faith to argue against slavery. The passage I read from at the beginning was from DeBow's Review, a Southern journal, in an essay titled Slavery in the Bible, published in 1850. The author had a very different understanding of the Bible than slaves did in regard to the issue of slavery. Although African slaves brought to the U.S. were mostly followers of tribal religions initially, most eventually adopted Christianity and believed that God had made everyone equal. Many slaves were inspired by the story of Moses leading his people, the Israelites, out of slavery from Egypt. What the slaves did not realize, however, was that ancient Israelites had much more in common with white Americans than they did with black Americans. Consider this. The Israelites were once allies on good terms with Egypt, but were later oppressed and subjugated by an Egyptian monarch. They gained their freedom, though, and thus were free to go on to oppress others. They conquered the Promised Land in Canaan with God on their side, killing or driving out the native inhabitants and taking slaves from the nations around them. Similarly, white Americans were once allies on good terms with England, but were later oppressed and subjugated by an English monarch. Well, sort of. It was very light oppression, all things considered. Well, anyway, they fought for their freedom, won, and thus were free to go on to oppress others. They conquered the Promised Land, west of the Appalachian Mountains, with God on their side, their manifest destiny, killing or driving out the native inhabitants, and keeping slaves from a foreign continent as their laborers. DeBow's journal references how God's faithful servant Abraham held slaves. It talks about Paul's epistle to Philemon in the New Testament, where Paul returned the slave Onesimus to his master Philemon rather than telling Philemon to set him free. When slaves would escape to the free northern states in the U.S., Southerners demanded that they be returned to their masters. Those who refused to do so were not being Christ-like. They were in fact acting against the example of the holy disciple of Jesus, Paul. The journal also references the specific laws codifying and regulating the practice of slavery in Old Testament books such as Leviticus. It points out that if slavery was such an evil and immoral practice, then the Bible would have specifically condemned it at some point. And the author is right. The Bible never explicitly condemns slavery once in 1,189 chapters, and it explicitly supports slavery at multiple points in both the Old and New Testaments. God freeing the Israelites from slavery by the Egyptians was not at all a condemnation of slavery itself. The Israelites were God's chosen people, so it was not right for them to be enslaved, but it was perfectly just for them to enslave others. Leviticus 25, verses 44 to 46. You may purchase male and female slaves among the nations around you. You may also purchase the children of temporary residents who live among you, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as a permanent inheritance. You may treat them as slaves, but you must never treat your fellow Israelites this way. The Bible specifically states that God's chosen people could only keep their fellow man in bondage as temporary indentured servants with certain rights, but heathens and their children could be kept in bondage forever. If this sounds familiar, it was also the exact same system set up in the 13 colonies of Britain. Whites could sell themselves into bondage as temporary indentured servants as payment for some kind of debt. But black savages, who were enslaved not knowing the light of Christ, could be kept along with their descendants as slaves forever. When actually studying the Bible, it is clear that the author of the DeBow Journal had a much more accurate interpretation of Scripture regarding slavery than Christian slaves and abolitionists did.